Welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with authors a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writers Center. I am also a fiction writer and novelist, and one of the early workshops I took was with our guest today, Karen Russell, who is a friend, a mentor, an idol. I have a long list of words I could use, but I'll stop with those. So Karen, I want to thank you so much for this is a joy. Since we started this series, I've wanted Karen to come join it. So I finally got a new book and was able to pull it off.
I'm so happy to be here. And, I also could dump out the Roget's thesaurus of beautiful modifiers for Zach Powers. He's one of my idols too, and a friend. And we really met so long ago, Zach. It's shocking.
15 years.
Uh-huh. So, and we were just reminiscing. I mean, the last time I saw Zach in all of our dimensions was when I was touring Orange World, and I really haven't been on the road. You remember that global pandemic. So I'm a little, I've just been feeling sort of rusty and out of practice at the public part of this. And on the schedule, when I saw Zach Powers, I knew I was just going to be sliding into home. So it's really wonderful to be here. And I guess that's my disclaimer is I'm going to do my best to be my most lucid self. Um, but yeah, I do. I feel like a little out of practice
Oh,
at the
you're gonna
public
rock it. It's gonna be
facing
amazing.
part, at the talking about writing part. I'm happy to get to do this because I just assume if you're here, you're a writer too. So, it's like everyone's behind the Oz curtain and we can be honest about the hallucinatory journey of writing anything.
Well, before we get to talking about writing, if you have your book handy, could you read us up to a couple pages, just a taste of this new novel, so that those who haven't had a chance to read it yet have an idea of what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to. And thank you again for having me, Zach. And thank you guys all for coming. It's fun to haunt a Zoom room with fellow makers. I feel lucky to get to be here with you. I'm just going to read a little bit from the opening. This is a section from the point of view of a woman I call a prairie witch. She wakes up during the Black Sunday dust storm, to discover that all of these memories that she stored for her customers in this town have sort of been whisked out of her body. Her job is absorbing and storing memories for people. So the Prairie Witch. A person can lose everything in an instant. A fortune, a family, the sun. I've had to learn this lesson twice in my life. The first time it happened, I was a 15-year-old fugitive from the Home for Unwed Mothers. The second time I was a prairie witch chained to my cot in a cinder block jailhouse. Your second home, the sheriff likes to say. Officially, I do not exist in his West. Nevertheless, it is a crime to pay me a visit. On Black Sunday, before anybody knew to call it Black Sunday, I woke up in the jailhouse to a sound like a freight train tunneling through me. An ear-splitting howl that seemed to shake the stone walls. My body trembled like a husk on the cot, my fingers clawed into the mattress. For those early moments in the dark, I was nothing but the fear of floating off. What had happened to me while I slept? It felt as if a knife had scraped the marrow from my bones. Something vital inside me had liquefied and drained away, and in its place was the new weightlessness, lightness, and wrongness, a blanketing whiteness that ran up my spine and seeped out of my mouth. Bankrupt was the word that rose in my mind and attached itself to my condition. At first, I did not recognize the voice crying out for help. I clamped down on the sound, panicked. I could not afford to lose any more ballast. My numb limbs began to prickle with feeling, pins and needles stitching them back to my brain. It was not a happy reunion. 10 white toes sprouted like mushrooms on the edge of a filthy green blanket, waving to me from the outermost limit of what I could make out. A kerosene lantern in the hallway gave off a feeble emerald glow, beyond which the cell plunged into shadow. Not even the pain was mine. It came and went like the wind. Then it drilled through my skin and swallowed the world. Or perhaps the black blizzard was already well underway when I woke up. Choking heat filled the jailhouse, along with lashing tails of dust. It occurred to me that I might be buried here before I could recollect who I was. Minutes lost all meaning. I balled up on the cot and prepared to be pulled apart. Eventually, light cut a pathway across the turbulent sky. I watched a pale line brightening and widening through the small cell window. A greenish disk hung above the cloud wall, and it took me ages to recognize the sun. It was not midnight after all, but well past noon. I began to remember more about the land beyond this cell, the edgeless prairie. The name of the town where I worked returned to me, Uz, Nebraska, southeast of the Sandhills and west of the Platte. We were 4 years into the worst drought that any newcomer to the Great Plains had ever experienced. Other beings kept older diaries. Cord cottonwood trees told a millennial story written in wavy circles that no politician had cared to read. Congressmen train themselves to think in election cycles, not planetary ones. They see spiking market highs and lows. They forget how to read in circles. Us had been having brownouts for months, plagues of jaws and mandibles. Grasshoppers rattled down on the tractor cabs from hissing clouds. Thousands of rabbits fanned over the plains, chewing through anything green. Winged indigo beetles blew in from God alone knew where, hush-shaped like hourglasses that nobody on the plains had ever seen before 1931. Red sand from Oklahoma and black dirt from Kansas and dove-gray earth from the eastern plains of Colorado formed a rolling ceiling of dust above us that flashed with heat lightning. My job returned to me before my name did. Yes, I am the antidote. I learned and remembered. I am a prairie witch. A door swung open onto my life. That's it. That's the opening.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you read that too, because this may be a paraphrase rather than direct quote, but other beings kept older diaries is one of the things I remembered. I like put a little tab next to, and I love, anyway, I love
Oh,
all
I
your
love
writing.
the trees diaries, right? I think that's so amazing. I
Yeah.
was, yeah, just with my daughter on a hike and we were looking at, yeah, the trees diaries.
Mhm. So we're here to talk about craft. So our first question that we like to ask is, where does the thinking about the craft of writing fall into your process? In other words, when are you most aware of the more mechanical parts of the writing process versus when are you more free-flowing or intuitive?
I think a first draft, I'm always really kind of driven by the sound of sentences. And often it's like the sound will lead me to the sense of things. But it's sort of a perverse way to write because it means that I do make a big mess, right? But it's like the sentences have to have a kind of integrity. I really can't move forward if the sentences don't feel right to me. So it's kind of a wasteful way to write, Zach, right? Because it's like I'm like belly crawling along. I have a friend who says he's like a cathedral builder, and he'll kind of have like the an outline and make the giant, skeleton, and then kind of go in and embroider, which seems like very sane. I've heard Kelly Link say she always knows the ending of her stories, which also, I mean, I never feel that way. I always feel like I'm just doing donuts in the sky, getting ready to parachute down. I'm like, wow, it would be wonderful to know, have the coordinates of your destination. Um, but yeah, I think that the sound often will direct me, and that's a mysterious thing, but clicking into the rhythms of something and feeling it gathering a kind of momentum and trusting that to lead you. Charles Ambrosio is a writer who I really love. He has a beautiful essay about that. How music, for the body, right? Music for the breath. That's what prose is. Um, and I think poetry helped me a lot and still helps me. Like when I really get stuck, or when I'm really just like sick to death of the grammar of my own thinking, like your own default sentences, it kind of disrupts that and it like makes you go slow and kind of pay attention to how language is freighted. Um, but I do think like there's just no way around the fact that like a first draft, in my experience, is very bad. And you don't know what you're doing. And everything, like the pacing is off, right? And and you're sort of writing the way a reader reads. You're like, well, what would happen if this was the situation? Who are these people? Why are they behaving this way, right? I mean, I think that what if is sort of what you hitch your star to when
Yeah,
you're writing.
you mentioned Kelly Link, who joined us previously for a craft chat, and she mentioned the knowing the endings thing. I'm like,
Yeah.
I know the ending maybe halfway through sometimes. I started a new story like 2 days ago, there's 2,000 words, no idea where it's going.
Right, and that is so much more my experience. This was an interesting book because I sort of had the characters and I had I mean without giving anything away, there's sort of the climax of it I think I did in a vague way, like a blurry Polaroid. I did sort of have that awareness of how things would come together. But there was so much I didn't know and so much that surprised me. And that's been my continuous experience. Like I wrote this novel, Swamplandia, and I had written the short story. And my delusion at that time was that like because I'd written the short story and I knew like the world and the characters, that like this novel would take like a summer to write and that it would just be sort of like an accordion, like just sort of like extending a story. And of course that was foolish, but yeah, I love hearing about other writers' approaches because it shows you that it is so wildly idiosyncratic.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned sentences too in your previous comment, and that was the first thing I sort of wanted to talk to you about because I've been reading your writing for 15 years. I'm going to admit right now that when I signed up for your workshop, when I took with you 15 years ago, I had not actually read your story collection yet. I did read it before I took the workshop, but I signed up blind, and it was one of the best decisions I could have made. So um, I've always paid extra close attention to your sentences, and sometimes I actually use the phrase, don't be too embarrassed by this, but I use Karen Russell sentence as like a thing to describe a certain type of sentence that you write. Um, and there's something just distinct about the flow and the logic and the language, but I've never gotten to really ask you about them. So I'm going to take this moment to ask you about your sentences. And what is a sentence to you? And what are you paying attention? You mentioned language a little bit. What are you paying attention to as you write and revise a single sentence?
Goodness, I will say too, because I found this sort of humbling. My brother's a brilliant writer,
He
just
is.
like one of our finest writers. I wish more people knew about him. But when he first started writing, one thing that was made present to me is like my syntax. I'm like, wow, is it nature or nurture? Who can really parse this? But I mean, genuinely, we write sentences that are his metaphors, like he's sort of an analogator, like his analogies even. I mean, we have there's some familial resemblance. Yeah, in like the grammar of our thinking or how we make sense of reality. So that was sort of so interesting. To kind of read him. We're very different kinds of writers in other ways, but I think he's such a sound freak and so much about sort of establishing one rhythm and then disrupting it, right? Like having some surprise. I think I had good teachers. I love George Saunders. I'm sure many of us do, right? And Kelly, who I mentioned. But Virginia Woolf also. I remember reading The Waves and sort of starting to understand that book was a challenging one for me. And then suddenly it was like when I surrendered to the rhythms of what she was doing, I wasn't disoriented anymore. I sort of was letting myself travel between these consciousnesses. Um, and maybe that was one lesson in trusting some part of you that's a little bit ahead of your waking consciousness, if that makes sense, without sounding too mystical about it. My favorite experiences as a writer are when I feel like I'm playing catch up just a little bit. And so it's not quite as amazing as like taking dictation from something else, which I wish, I've heard other writers describe it that way, like hearing a voice and just transcribing. It's rarely that. But I do sort of think it's almost like getting hauled along by the sound of something and trusting that there is something scaffolding, there is meaning, right? That it's not just amfiggery, that there's um that you're being Stephen King talks about the undermined, which I really like. Something about that word, right? I think other people say you're subconscious or but like just trusting that your undermined is up to something that's wiser or wilder than your kind of lame conscious ambitions. Um, and like craft wise, I think um you guys can I read out loud a lot and I'm always revising. Like that section I just read you, I was like cutting clauses and kind of moving stuff around. Still, the book is published. I can't mess with it anymore. But um because even if people are having this quiet experience, right? You're like reading silently, you're still scoring that music for the breath, which is such a unsettling thing about reading. My son, who's 8, Zach, he was like, Mama, do you hear this story in this outside voice when you read? And I was like, oh no, not really. I guess not. And he was like, yeah, me neither. And I was like, what do you hear the stories in? And maybe it's Jack Nicholson's voice. I really don't know, He couldn't tell me.
That would be amazing if your child was just thinking in Jack Nicholson's voice.
I just thought, but he
Yeah.
was sort of unnerved by that, right? He was like, I mean, I just thought that was an incredible question about the mystery of consciousness too. I mean, I don't know yeah, maybe it's like a baritone, I really don't know. But I think anyway, and that's sort of like that advice is around, right? But just reading out loud will teach me something about where you're kind of in like a stagnant pocket too. I know Antonia Nelson, when we were at Tin House, I think gave a lecture about the first person and how dreadful it can feel when it's just every single sentence is I down the line. Um,
Great, thank
but
you.
I'm trying to give a more specific answer, Zach. I don't mean to sound so general about it too.
Oh, it's all good.
Verbs
Um,
matter a lot. I could say that, right? Like I had a professor who wouldn't let us write passive verbs, and this resulted in some bizarre, convoluted workarounds, But I think it also made me conscious of how often I would sort of slip into some passive construction or the autofill of the imagination, right? Like I call that like the gnarled oak syndrome. And it's just sort of like the first modifier that occurs to you, and it's probably not good, right? Like if it's sort of, if that's like the reflexive, right? The stock photo, like I think it's in first drafts that can happen, but I love this about Zach's writing. It's so precise and so idiosyncratic. I feel like so much of style is just like that thumbprint of consciousness, right? Like, and I don't know if you guys have read Zach, he's like he pays such amazing attention. And whatever's on the other side of the equal sign of a Zach Powers metaphor is not what you're expecting. And it illuminates something also about the consciousness that's perceiving.
okay, you're not supposed to make me bashful in these events. It's supposed to be the other way around, but thank you. And you mentioned verbs, and actually that is, I so often like, I won't say I notice verbs in the first time because that would be a distraction, but I like, why did that feel so nice? Then go back and like, oh, that was the thing that pushed the sentence to the level that felt so pleasing to read. And it's so often just a verb choice.
Yeah, yeah.
So you meant we like each other's writing, and I think part of that might be because we are people who like weird things, if I can say that. I believe you used that. I think years ago you coined the term team weird in some discussion, and I've clung to that for 15 years since. So um, I think you show a deep respect for your subjects. I think that is a key to being writer is being respectful to your subject. And even reverence for your subject, but I also know that you are just sort of at your core, like you, I don't say I should know, but I feel that you have this deep just love of the weird twist, of something weird, of something being strange, and finding out what the strangeness means. So, and also from that, and maybe either from that or leading to that, is the concept of imagination being an important part of the writing process, as opposed to reportage or writing something more autofiction or personal like that. Can you talk a little bit about how you jibe honoring and respecting your subjects, especially in a book like this one with a lot of subjects that need respect, with the weirdness and maybe an instinct towards play and imagination?
I love that question. And just like, I don't know, there's no art way to do this, but here with us tonight is one of our Team Weird comrades, Carol Jean Gavin, who has a beautiful book coming out that everybody should pre-order. I don't know if maybe we could throw a link in the chat or something.
I'll grab it.
Congratulations,
Yeah,
Carol
I'll
Jean
grab the link.
Gavin. Yeah, I do feel just kind of playful in the world, and I don't really always see it as like separate from taking things seriously, as I know you don't either, Zach. I mean, I I think too sometimes like I'll hear my writing described as sort of whimsical or quirky or the whatever series of Roget's modifiers come from that or synonyms for that. And I often think like not to take umbrage at something like that, but always there's some darker underbelly for me, right? And I think a lot of what's interesting to me about what fiction can do is I operate from the assumption that we're all sort of underestimating the strangeness of this life and one another all of the time, I feel that can happen to me on like any given day where you're just sort of under the spell of your name and you're in like the trance of your everyday concerns, and it's harder to appreciate like what is truly bizarre and beautiful and mysterious about this place. I remember I had this novella Sleep Donation come out, and somebody was saying like how just sort of saying like, where do you come up with this wild stuff? And I was just thinking, we lay prone on these mattresses for a third of our lives, hallucinating, like having experiences that have the texture of reality that dissolve, when the sun coagulates in the sky and we contract into this thing again. It's very strange. And so that fantasy reality binary always feels a little bogus to me. I love these people and these books that I write, even when they're especially when they're deeply flawed, like how could it be otherwise? And I have a harder time, I think. Maybe I'm just getting like softer in midlife, but there are some books where the pleasure is like a kind of haughty, superior, like a sort of, um, yeah, like an icy disdain for the people in the book, or you're just invited to feel like an easy superiority or to sort of stand in judgment of them or their punchlines. I find those books really hard and not very interesting. Um, and I think like that also sounds ridiculous out loud, but I mean, I do think sort of like a real love of these people, because it's good too, right? Because you spend a lot of time with these characters that in a book in progress. And they frustrate me too, just like, real people do, sometimes like if it's the writing's going really well, they feel like as real to me and as distinct from me in some way as like my own family members or friends. Um, but I suppose you're always like extrapolating from your terrestrial relationships. So there's that too. I don't think anything is ever like one-to-one autobiography that I've written, but like some things feel a little closer to home than other things.
Yeah, I recently wrote a craft essay, but on the concept of generosity, but it's generosity to like self and reader and character. And I think it's a taste. I mean, maybe if you like slightly vindictive lit, maybe vindictive lit is a valid genre of literature, but I'm sort of with you. I'm not my cup of tea.
Zach paid me one of the greatest compliments of my Earth time. Do you remember when we talked about the distinction between kindness and niceness?
Hmm.
And it really matters. But I mean, yeah, I love Flannery O'Connor. I love her writing.
Yeah.
And she has such a pitiless compassion for her people. It's somehow never sentimental, but it's not, I don't know. It's this, she holds all of what they are and with dark humor and with a keen sight, with a real moral clarity. But I feel like even when those stories are like desperately sad and desperately funny, the people are not cartoons, they're not punchlines.
Yeah.
Um, and that is a tricky thing to sort of orient yourself to a character in that way. I mean, terrible things happen to the people in my books, as in life. I was just reading, do you guys like Paul Tremblay? I love Paul Tremblay. I was rereading The Cabin at the End of the World, which just broke my heart. I can't believe how that book concludes. I'm going to invoice Paul Tremblay for my open heart surgery. Um, but I feel like that's a book that's so unsparing of its characters and its readers, but it's also it's such a love story. Um, I don't know. I was just thinking about how it's hard to do all of that, right? It's hard to
Mm.
sort of let your characters have a destiny that involves a lot of suffering, you know, um, and also maybe showcases the ways that they're monstrously, with the monstrous things that we're all maybe capable of in
Mhm.
certain situations.
Yeah.
Um, without, yeah, while still wanting to preserve some fuller sense of their kind of humanity.
Thank you. So I believe questions are rolling into the chat. So I'm going to turn to the chat for a bit and try to get a few over there. Um, Someone says, if I called it correctly, and I'm now ancient, so there's every chance they do not. This book took a long time to finish. What was it that got you unstuck and allowed you to finish?
Oh, goodness. Well, let's see. I mean, I had really put it aside. I tried to write this book several times and it just never really took off. But some of the stories in Vampires in the Lemon Grove and Orange World and Sleep Donation also, I think all of these books were sort of orbiting some of the same questions that and concerns and regions. Like I wrote a story, a horror story about the Homestead Act in Vampires in the Lemon Grove. There's a story in that book called The New Veterans about this woman who believes that she's helping a veteran to ease his burdens by sort of literally needing one, his history out of his body. And I think in some ways she's a precursor to this Prairie Witch character. There's a story, Reeling for the Empire, which
Mm.
is next to the horror story about the Homestead Act, and just also thinking through how some of these massive global forces and metamorphoses play out in people's bodies, and that's a story about textile workers in Japan who end up tithing all of their daylight, all of their dreaming to this machine. So I think that all to say, like, it took a long time, but I think I really wasn't ready to write it when I got the idea. And part of what got me unstuck was having children. That did just open up some space, I think, or it helped me to reconnect with this book. Some of it was like I started basically from scratch during the pandemic. We had these tremendous wildfires here in Portland. And it did, like, I mean, it looked, the sky was full of ash. The sun, my Oscar, who was 3 then, was like, the sun turned into Mars. I mean, it was like Sauron's red eye. And the air you couldn't breathe. So this room I'm sitting in used to be the baby's nursery. And I was like putting towels around it. Our house isn't really insulated very well. You could like smell the smoke in here. And I think it was such a visceral feeling of like the climate crisis, the bill coming due for how we've been treating people and this home we share. And somehow I think that was also a bridge to this voice. I just started writing in the first person, which was a shift. Earlier versions had been in the third person, and I had like a lot of ideas about what I wanted to do, but it felt sort of stiff and dead. It felt like self-conscious and wrong. And then I think somehow, I mean, the what I just read you was what I wrote in, like, I forget now, but like late 2020, early 2021, and it exists almost verbatim as it did um, at that time. But I let that encourage and discourage everybody, because genuinely, like when I met you, Zach, I had the idea for this book. I hadn't even published Swamplandia yet, but I had the idea that that would be the next thing. And it, yeah,
Yeah.
unlike human infants, books have such weird gestational,
Yeah,
um,
I went to a book launch last night for my friend Sam Ashworth, and he read two passages from a book that were like original passages he first wrote, but like 15 years ago or something.
thousands of years in the
Yeah,
book.
like
It's funny too. I mean, it's totally okay, but a lot of the press about this book so far has been like, lady comes out of a coma with a new novel, like millennia after that first novel. And I feel like I don't know. I don't know what to say about that.
you've
Oh.
published story collections in the interim, and I'm assuming everyone here knows Karen's stories, but you mentioned Spinning for Empire. Did I say
Yeah, Reeling for the Empire.
Reeling
I
for
mean,
Empire? Thank you. I had the wrong. Yeah, yeah.
both of my kids were, I was telling them, I was like, no, but it's my sixth book, children. And my daughter was like, oh, only 6? Because they're like making books all the time.
Yeah.
They also were very skeptical that this is a job. I was like, I also teach people to write stories. And they were like, hmm. I mean, because most of their waking life is pretending, right? Most of how they understand themselves and the earth is just narrative.
I could not mount a compelling argument against their position. So that's
Yeah, no, totally. I know. At one point during the pandemic, my son was like hammering at the wall and kind of like gibbering to himself. And I remember telling Tony, my husband, I was like, is this developmentally appropriate, or is he like going mad? And he said, which was true, he's like, he's just doing what you do at the laptop.
that's true. All right, so going back to some questions from the audience. Karen, you write amazing similes and metaphors. Do you practice this as craft, or you just possess a knack for it? I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, well, as I mentioned, like reading my brother, who is just like a simile machine. I think some of it is just, I don't know if compulsion is the right word. I mean, I just think that is like how I understand things. I mean, most of us understand the world by analogy, but I think, yeah, some of the wilder ones, uh, you know, um, I love Dennis Johnson. And I remember having a class where our professor put all of his similes on the board, and one was birds like punctuation. I remember thinking how gorgeous that was. And then, but interestingly, this was just interesting pedagogy. I don't know. Our professor had us raise our hands if we could track the metaphor. And the ones that were like maybe a standard deviation away from, yeah, what your own brain would produce or could see. Like it was interesting. I mean, it was hands kept falling, right? The farther out there the analogy got. And the more of a reach it was, or sort of the more kind of surprising and idiosyncratic it was. So none of that really feels engineered. I think that is just like how I think and write and see things. This book feels a little more controlled. It feels a little more spare than other things I've written. Or it felt that way to me writing it. I think part
It's Drylandia. You said it was Drylandia. You need the special
Thailandia.
prose to tie
Yeah.
in with the setting.
Yeah, but I mean, but yeah, it has a sort of these are deposits, right? So there's a kind of a confessional, almost like a low whisper of a register, and it's a little more spare and plain spoken, I think, than other things I've done, and that felt right for this book. And it'll be interesting to see. I have a story collection I'm working on now, and I sort of feel in a nice way or a disorienting way, like I'm not totally sure what kind of writer I am at this moment. I don't know, like if 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 there will be um wild, lavish metaphors, or if it'll be a little more
Mhm.
straight. I don't know.
That's awesome. And Dennis Johnson, yeah. I mean, my last novel project, I read either Dennis Johnson or Amy Bender every morning before sitting down to write, just because I wanted to channel something from either of them, if
Oh,
possible,
yeah,
into my
to-
writing.
totally. Well, now because I see someone in the chat, my brother's name is Ken Russell. I want to tell you one of my favorite of his
Yes.
analogies. He said, he has so many, but one of my favorites is the fanny pack is like a title belt for virgins.
He really is a brilliant writer.
Yeah. He
Yeah.
wouldn't like that that's what I led with, but
Yeah.
I think that's one of the funniest ones.
That's what you do for brothers, though. Never share
No, I know. That's
the
also that's also true.
So another question from the audience. The question from the audience is, who are some of your favorite authors and why? And I'm going to tack on my question is, were there any particular authors or books that you felt were influences for this project?
Oh yeah, for sure. So, and I mentioned Zach Powers and Carol Jean Gavin, two of my favorite writers. I also love, I mean, Kelly, I mentioned Octavia Butler, I loved. Frank Herbert, when I was a kid, I think Dune had such an impact on me, just in terms of like another world to go to understand this one. This book, a huge influence on this book was The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Do some people know this by, I mean, it's another sort of polyphonic composite portrait of a place. And you sort of, I just love this book. I wouldn't have thought of The Prairie Witches, I'm sure, if I hadn't read that book, which has John Singer, he's a deaf mute man, and he's sort of the keeper of secrets of this Georgia mill town. But it also has this character, Mick, who I read that book when I was exactly her age. And it was the first time I had read an adult novel that took the interior of a young person so seriously. Yeah, and it's a diverse cast, and you just see the way that these people's lives in the very same place are constrained in different ways, and what they suffer together and alone in this place. I love Paradise by Toni Morrison. I love Beloved by Toni Morrison. Speaking of just history and the way that it cohabits and shapes the present, I think Beloved, that's our masterpiece. Um, Gosh, I mean, Sonora Babb, The Lost Traveler, gave me some of the texture of this book. The Grapes of Wrath, is a masterpiece. A book called Native Historians Write Back has a section that really helped me to write what I think is kind of like the heart or the conscious of the Antidote. Um, the chapter by Dr. James Ridingen. Louise Erdrich, like everything Louise writes. I don't know if so. I mean, I read this after I finished The Antidote, but The Mighty Red, I think there's some shared concerns there. It's really so much about industrial agriculture and trying to like think about ways to get out of, how to turn this big leviathan that's destroying everything. Yeah, and the sorrow of sort of like understanding that the the way that you are making your living is part of what's destroying this place that you love. Uh-oh. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, okay. Just
Yeah.
checking. All right. This is the danger of Zoom where you like feel like you're monologuing in a Beckett play, you know? And you're like,
We
what's
let you
happening?
talk for like 10 minutes. We couldn't actually hear anything you said. So it's just,
Yeah, it really could happen. The scarecrow, there's a scarecrow. There's a spirit trapped in a scarecrow in here. I don't know if you guys have read Beckett's Malloy. I find this book to be so funny in the darkest way. That was a big influence
I read
on.
it because of you.
Did you?
Yeah. I remember still you were talking about how Beckett can like turn on like the most beautiful turn of phrase, then make a fart joke in the next second. And that's like someone so deft to make those turns it's absurd. So
Yeah.
I think about Beckett and in your language specifically every time I think about like making sharp turns in writing and language.
I think it's so that's a real skill, right? Like speaking to the craft of it. I mean, I really admire people who have that kind of ability. Louise is someone who does this expertly, truly, where there will be something sublime, some description of a Vesper flight that's like your tears are standing in your eyes. And then she'll know exactly when to undercut it so you can receive it, right? Or she'll know when to make a joke about, a funeral cake or bad sex, or right. It's just weaving that through. And often it's clause to clause that those things are happening. Because it's true. I mean, I don't know. I bet this is you too, Zach. Like, I really kind of tune out if something is just monotone, even if it's the most beautiful writing. If it's pages and pages of like lyrical writing about the sky, I do kind of glaze over a little. And sort of like yeah, the punch of humor, what it opens up. I love Calvino. I bet we've talked about him in the past too, but Cosmic Comics was such a teacher to me. These stories are like so winning, they're so disarming and charming, and then in like a really sly way, they'll become deeply philosophical, just deeply sad too.
Yeah, Cosmic Comics. Yeah, I think I maybe read that before. That was one of the books I discovered independently, but I think we shared Cosmic Comics in.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
dinosaurs, like just what could be better?
Yeah. Let's go to sorry, there's so many questions in the chat. So going back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, you talked about sentence sounds, but how do you move from sentence sounds to a story or plot? How does the plot grow from that initial impulse of sound?
Oh yeah. Well, I should say this too, because I did talk about sound. I will say like landscape matters to me a lot, like the world, the setting of a story is never just like a static backdrop. And I was teaching a course not so long ago for American short fiction. Um, with one of the lectures was I just called it setting is alive. I really believe that like the setting gives you everything. It's one of the reasons it took me so long to write this book is that I had to sort of like go out there because for Swamplandia and for earlier stories, my research was just that I was like a child and adolescent in South Florida, which was daunting in a different way. But I knew, that's what I'm made of, right? Like the whole vocabulary of my thinking like comes from those ecologies. But I think like thinking about like, well, what kind of people did this place make? Or who came here? Like, why would they come to this place and decide to put down a root or try to? What's possible or impossible in a place is a question I often start with. So because I do think like geography, it can give you dialogue, character, and plot too, right? Because if it's sort of usually you start, I mean, this book starts with a woman who in media res, she's gone bankrupt during in the middle of a blizzard. I mean, I like the perversity of that. And some of the suspense then is like, how did she get here? Like how did she come to be here? How did this come to be her dilemma? Um, and I think the Dust Bowl imposed incredible exigencies on people in different ways. So they all exist under the hammer of this apocalyptic weather, but they're experiencing it in different ways. And they become kind of united in the same mystery, but it's because of it's this place that is generating the plot, if that makes sense. Yeah, I really think that I wrote this story called The Prospectors, and like of the stories I've written, it had sort of the most straightforward structure in some ways. And part of that is because like the mountain gave me the structure. These two grifter girls go up a mountain, they take the wrong ski lift to a party. It's sort of like an inverted underworld story. But I mean, you know what I mean? It's just almost like whatever, whatever Freytag's, which is that we all learned in seventh grade, and then there are like Reeling for the Empire that I mentioned. That story found its structure from biology, right? From like the natural world. So I was writing about these silkworm workers. I mean, they're changed into literal silkworms, and they're just, instead of ever undergoing the next phase of their metamorphosis, they're tithing all of their silk to this machine. They're kind of stalled. They're trapped in this limbo, and they're on this factory clock. So getting time running again, I just followed that cycle of caterpillar to butterfly. So all to say, I mean, I don't know how helpful that is, but often if I'm stuck in a story, sometimes it's like the place will give me the solution, or sometimes like I look to like the natural world to see like how it's structuring humans' dramas, like humans living.
Yeah, so an interesting thing for me there is talking about the shape of a story. Okay, the mountain maybe is Freytag's pyramid or triangle, whatever it is. But you're talking about some other shapes which are clearly not traditional story arcs or triangles or that. And I'm really, really fascinated with the way that other shapes inform the way we can think about plot. I'm thinking of I believe it's Jane Allison's Meander Spiral Explode, the book on different plot shapes. Do you have any thoughts on plot shape and like how different shapes are just as maybe propulsive as what we think of as the usual arc?
Yeah,
I hope my hand was on camera. I did that. I sort of reached way over here to do it, but yeah.
for sure. I mean, well, for this book, right, I have this one point of view character who's a scarecrow. Like, what could be more dramatically inert? Speaking of perverse choices, I think that but like, this is just this dude who's like, I don't know, hanging out in a field. So it couldn't be more constrained in some ways. And, I was thinking, just speaking of Malloy, there's that beautiful line, I only know what the words know. So much of the drama for me there, it's like this ontological drama, or it's like what words come winging back into this consciousness, and it moves from the ability to recapture a past or have some foundation of fact to being able to imagine, to being able to sort of um, combine terrestrial fact into some new creation, right? Like to stitch wings onto a pronghorn antelope, right? Once it remembers what both those things are. So moving from sort of memory to invention, I thought there was like so much suspense in that. Nothing is actually happening like in time. Like this dude is just staked to one spot. So it was more sort of like um just the drama of becoming, slowing it down. Yeah. Um, learning and remembering, and then inventing, I don't, and then story shapes. I mean, this one really feels like a cyclone to me in a way, because things start to tighten and spiral, and
I
even
mean,
they're sort of even, and they're alternating rhythms between these points of view. And then in the last act, things really pick up speed. Um, and it's sort of, I mean, the weather gave me the shape of this one, right? It's bookended by a dust storm, this terrible drought, and then this tremendous flood, this torrent. So like walls of dust and walls of water.
yeah, the end of the book is, I mean, the chapter length literally shrinks drastically as we get to that very climactic section. So and you're alternating points, because the chapter lengths too is alternating points of view. So you're bouncing between these characters suddenly at this quick pace. And so, yeah, you almost get, I'm not going to clear this way, you almost get the final event in effect before the final event arrives, which is a really interesting way to,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's structural foreshadowing. Ooh, I've coined a new craft term.
A
Um,
friend of mine, Jason, was saying, and I just liked his phrasing, and I'll repeat it because I feel like it's smarter than what I know how to say. But I wrote this story called The Ghost Birds, where these paranormal bird watchers, this father and his daughter, end up going into, it's an elementary school here in Portland, is like the brick and mortar analog for this fictional school. But they kind of go into a school, they want to see the swifts that roost in this chimney, and they get stuck. And he was saying, he's like, Karen, I think you really love to like make these big worlds and then have your stories climax in their tightest corners. And I don't know that that quite applies here, but it is sort of, right? There is sort of, I mean, you can't really get a corner in the on on fallow land, out here in the on the prairie. But there's something about that. I think that felt true to me, right? Having a big world and then sort of um, pushing the characters to some limit.
Thank you. So there are so many good questions. I'm going to apologize. We're not going to get to nearly all of them, and I apologize for that. They're all worthy. I'm jumping over a couple that were on sort of similar topics we already covered and jumping to this one, which is I'm interested in the mysticism, spirituality of writing, and I've noticed this is something you've mentioned a bit in this talk. Could you speak more about mysticism and spirituality and in the writing process?
Yeah, I will try, even though I get kind of shy about that. Um, I was
Oh,
reading a review. I got kind of testy about it because this person said something. I don't think they meant it. Any writers don't write. There's no unfraught relationship to have with reviews. You know what I mean? Don't read them. But I did because I worked so long on this, and I am curious. I'm like, what do the people think? What you? I mean, it doesn't exist until some reader makes it live at all. But it was sort of like, I don't ever think that I'm conjuring something from way out there. That's not really my experience. Like I wish that it was, as I mentioned, I wish I felt like I was, but I do, it's interesting. Like I think that fiction helps me to access something that is wiser and older and a little distinct from whatever chattering consciousness I mostly inhabit, like I wouldn't want to do it. Or one of the pleasures of reading and writing is like Maureen McLean is a poet I love. She calls it deep seas to dream and make a self in. And I do sort of feel often connected to something that is just like vaster than I am. I love Flannery O'Connor's prayer journal. I really, it's interesting to see how writing is a spiritual practice for her.
happy
Um,
100th birthday to Flannery, too, while we're mentioning Flannery.
and I mean, there's another person who's complex and right holds some views that are certainly not my own, but just her vertical orientation. I read a book by this writer E. Lily Yu that was very moving to me called oh gosh, make oh E. Lily Yu, forgive me, Break, Blow, Burn, and Make, I think. And I mean, even if you're not a person of faith, like it just this sort of vertical orientation where it's really not about a market at all, where it's really sort of like a form of attention that is love, I think Simone Weil has, I'm paraphrasing Simone, forgive me, Simone, but just that sort of sense of the reverence that you pay the world when you pay that kind of careful attention, when you give that attention. Um, so I'm not sure if that quite answers the question. In this book is really in dialogue with the book of Job, which is my favorite book in the Bible and a deeply mysterious book. Um, and
There's a little Job, yeah, yeah. There's some Job
and
references.
yeah, and I mean, I think there's sort of even some of on the page, there's some sections where these people are having this farmer is having this experience in his fallow land. He's not sure if he's hallucinating. He's not sure if, he's being punished or experiencing a miracle. He's questioning the evidence of his senses. He really can't understand his strange fortune, and he's seeing this color. My husband was joking, it was like the color from out of space, from outer space. I don't know if you guys know that story. I think for me, it was really the inspiration really was Job, and he's sort of throwing the darts of his mind. Speaking of analogy, right? It's like, what is this color? It's not hoof, it's not icicle, it's not eggshell, it's not snakeskin, it's not agate. It's just everything that it's not also ends up being like a sneaky autobiography of this guy to me, because you're getting like an infection of the world of his references and all of his like failed hypotheses. And I remember I got to take a workshop with the great Marilyn Robinson about Moby Dick. And this really stayed with me, and I offer it to you. She talks about how in that book, there are so many nets of metaphor that get cast out, and none of them do the job of approaching the sublimity of this whale. And it's sort of like in their failure to apprehend the grandeur of this whale, you do get some sense of that scale and its miraculous strangeness. And so I am not, Marilyn, and I am not Old Herman. But I loved that. I think that was a teaching for me. And as like the book of Job too, where it's like, Job doesn't really get an answer that you can paraphrase. He gets swept up in this whirlwind and replanted in his life, and his questions they've disintegrated. Like he's seen something, he's had some cosmic apprehension of the real scale of things. And he's been sort of, it's like the Copernican revolution, or that's my reading. Like he's been displaced from the center of the story. Um, and I think that right now that feels like a powerful lesson too. I mean, this is getting a little bit away from craft, but I think just sort of like I often think this in fiction when it's like so welded to one consciousness or the one human drama, and you never really pan out to see like the vaster world that a character is embedded in. I get sort of claustrophobic, and then things feel sort of false when there's not that sort of pivot to this other than human reality. What a
Thank you.
crazy answer. I'm sorry, guys.
Right. Well, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to take one more from the chat, then ask our usual final question. The last one from the chat I'm going to take is, I first discovered you through Orange World and the New Yorker, which captured motherhood in a way that felt absolutely definitive. How much of an engine is mothering for you?
Oh, I think it's really changed. It's made me a much slower writer for sure. Um, this book, there's this woman whose child is stolen from her at a home for unwed mothers, and that's kind of the loss that dynamites this hole inside her that she's like renting out as storage to her customers. There's this feral child whose mother was murdered. So they're sort of the center for me. There are these hole punched images in the book too. There's something about these people meeting around these enormous losses, this childless mother and this motherless child. And I don't know that I would have been able to write towards that before having children of my own. The loss that I felt most viscerally, there's this book gets into some really devastating history that has ongoing legacies. There are no American Indian families that aren't touched by the federal boarding schools. And that's part of this book too. Sort of this home for unwed mothers operated like an hour from the Federal Indian Boarding School at Genoa. And you guys can all go and look online. There's this beautiful digital reconciliation project, and it's to bring this history home to Native American families and communities, but also to everybody. It was sort of suppressed for so long. And this was a place where, connections were severed, by design. I mean, to call it a school is like a horrible euphemism. I mean, it's a place of forced assimilation, coerced assimilation, where children are kidnapped and sent to live often hundreds of miles away from their parents, and they're forbidden to speak their languages, they're forbidden to practice their spirituality. Um, they're there are these sites of stolen past and futures, and like the theft of real children. So this is a long answer, but I think like I felt that in a really animal way writing this book, the horror of that, and that some of these losses are irreversible. And then it also, if I feel hope at all, I think it's because people really, there is real love for like the generations that are going to come after us. Like I feel that everywhere I go, like that is common ground that people can find, right? Like wanting to make sure that the people who come after us have like a living world, a habitable world, and like a functioning and caring society. And so I think like we need that love to power whatever revisions will make such a world possible. And I also don't want to like fetishize mother, like a lot of my dearest friends don't have children. Like it's not like it's any more or less fulfilling, but just for me personally, like it is the greatest part of being alive. And I think it made me a slower, more haggard writer. But yeah, but I think that I like this book is much more earnest and direct than other things I've written. And that's part of that is the children too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I want to move to our final question, which is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out, or perhaps what's a piece of advice you wish you'd received when you were just starting out?
Oh, let me think about this. Sorry, I'm just gonna throw this in the chat because I mentioned it, and it'd be great if people want to check this
Yes.
out. Also, I updated my website, which was like an obituary of 2020 with the help of Cowbird Creative, which my best friend runs. So I mentioned that to you guys. There's like a bunch of whatever I just mentioned, there's a bunch of that on my website too now. Um, I wish somebody had told me when I was a younger writer that it really is okay to write what delights you, that it's not cheating, that you don't have, like, I really think I loved writing these wild stories about children and animals, and somehow I internalized some hierarchy of being that like this was just not serious, it wasn't literature. Right, you couldn't tell you couldn't have the Vesper flight that ends in a fart joke. Like, I think it took me a little while to really let myself, yeah, write in the direction of my pleasure. I heard Helen Vendler say that once, and it was pleasure is a good guide to what you should be doing next, which I mostly agree with, assuming you're not like an axe murderer, which in that case, don't listen to Helen's advice.
Well, I will add my own little piece of advice, which is get to know when you're starting out an author who lets you know that it's okay to be delighted by the process of writing. So Karen, that was certainly, you're one of those people for me. So it's been a delight tonight as well to catch up with you a little bit and hear some of your thoughts on writing. It's been a while since, other than maybe reading an article here and there, I've gotten to hear you share your thoughts on writing. So I'm in my happy place for the night. I want to thank everybody else for coming out, and Karen, it's a pleasure as always.
Thank you guys so much for coming. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of your questions, but I'll be on the road. Come out and I'll answer questions. Um, we could talk more about the rat battle that is the Book of Job. Um,
And I think I
yeah.
saw there was one comment from, I believe, Julie. So if Julie, you're still here, I will pass that along as well. It was just a comment about a good moment that you chatted after some event, and it really helped them out. So I'll pull the chat, make sure I
Oh,
get
I'm
that to
glad.
you.
I mean, that's the other thing, right, Zach? Like, don't give up. And also, if this idea continues to haunt you, it will until you write it. That's my encouraging, discouraging advice. I really tried not to write this book. I decided I was just like a story writer, and it just kept coming back. So if you are having that experience, just commit yourself and write this book because there's no way out but through. And
Mhm.
and yeah, just trust that that instinct that gave you the idea will see its good work through.
Mhm. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming, and have
Thank you guys for coming.
a
Thank you,
great rest of
Zach.
your
It's a
evenings.
real pleasure.